sex workers at Reddit. What is the saddest experience, client-wise, you've had while on the job? I've worked as a dominatrix and as an escort. And my saddest experience was one of my submissives. I saw this client a few times. He was morbidly obese but very intelligent, funny and had a successful career. He was heavily into receiving pain and our sessions were on the more extreme end. Afterwards he'd want to cuddle and chat and laugh. One day, after our session, he told me he was finally retiring and going to solo travel and have some experiences. Not long after, a coworker who was a friend of him outside of work told me he had passed away. Based on the timeline, I doubt he ended up vacationing. I've had other clients who were depressed, in bad marriages, or unhappy with their lives. But he was the only client that I'd known to have passed away, and under such sad circumstances. A husband and wife booked me for a threesome because having a lesbian experience was on her bucket list. She'd recently recovered from a double mastectomy and had just been diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor, despite undergoing chemotherapy. In a private, fully clothed moment between the husband and I, he told me she doesn't have long left, and the way they looked at each other was so beautiful. Just pure love. I worked as an escort for about a year and a half. I had a regular client with a number of mental health issues in his mid-30s. He was an Asian guy whose family didn't believe in mental illness. He wouldn't socialize with anyone except for his family. He had a mental breakdown the year prior and had to quit his job. He had to sell his house and move back in with his parents. He had never had sex with anyone who wasn't a prostitute. He had never been on a date with a woman or had any female friends. He would book overnight appointments with me and we wouldn't even have sex. He just wanted the company. That's $3,500 he was paying for a sleepover with me. All he would ever want to do was talk and cuddle. He once told me I was his best friend. And how sad that was considering he had to pay me. And if there was no payment, I wouldn't even be there. Broke my heart. I cared for him very much, and still think of him from time to time. I had a few clients in my hometown and neighboring city. They were somewhat older, more career accomplished women who wanted discreet companionship. Most of them just wanted to cuddle and talk or listen to music and lay with me. Some liked drugs. Almost all of them liked wine. All of them were lonely. One of my clients was constantly out at parties or business functions. Very social and successful. And would contact me after. On Christmas one year she told me that she was previously married. Her husband started her business with her before he died. She told me she lived the happiest life with him but that it was too short. I think she was looking for a similar replacements for her husband but nobody lived up to the guy. Relationships are hard and then we die. I'm a stripper and honestly I refer to myself as a naked therapist. Probably my saddest moment was when a man was crying to me in VIP about his divorce. Another time I had someone come out as gay in a private dance. That was sad because he was married with a kid and didn't know what to do. A lot of clients from these stories seem to want a therapist who can cuddle them. I had a guy I gave a few lap dances to. His buddy took him out because he just got divorced. His wife was the one who left him. He was crying. I tried to give him a pep talk. Most of the time I spent was holding him. I obviously wasn't helping much. A stripper doesn't even come close to replacing your wife of 20 years. Especially when you've never been with anyone else. I almost cried too. Several of my male friends have told me that the worst thing after a breakup is that no one touches them. Just the physical comfort you offered probably helped that guy more than you imagine. Had a client who didn't speak much English. Afterwards we were lying down together. I got out my phone and we had a conversation via Google Translate. He told me that his wife had died 4 months earlier and that this was the first time he'd felt normal since. I was a dancer in college for girls and gay clubs. Never did anything private but would sit with generous customers. Most of the time I just tuned out whatever they were saying. Had one older guy that always wanted to talk and always said I reminded him of his ex-boyfriend. I'm straight and honestly probably not the nicest dancer in the club, but he wasn't creepy. He brought in a bunch of photos of him with his BF that were around 30 years old, and the guy looked like he could be my brother. The patron had married a woman, had a family and lived a straight life in public. His wife had left him and his kids wanted nothing to do with him. All he ever did was talk about his BF that had died shortly after he was married. He was so full of regret for not spending time with his BF. It was just painful. He never proposed anything else. Was always super respectful and generous. I genuinely felt bad for the guy. Not my story, but I knew a girl who did rent a night type of stuff. Guy asks her if she could come over. Doesn't talk about sex over the phone, just if she could come over and to come hungry. She thinks he is into feeding or some. She arrives at like 6 p.m. Pretty early for her work. She asks what he would like to do. He just cooks for her a really big delicious meal. Later he starts to open up a bit. His wife had passed and always loved his cooking. He had a spinal injury and was basically trapped in his body. Could barely speak and move. His mother booked me. I was told I'm going to be the last person he had sex with since he was planning on euthanasia later that year. We held each other and cried afterwards. When I left his room, his mother hugged me and cried. I couldn't accept payment for that one. She sent me a diamond necklace a week later with a note saying he'd passed. A guy literally crying about how lonely he was. We didn't even have sex. He just wanted to hang out. He was a really nice guy, but I had to cut off contact after that one encounter because he had the idea that he was going to save me from drugs and prostitution and wife me up or something. I felt horrible. I used to be a sex cam worker. I had a regular client who always paid for private time with me. Nothing really did anything sexual for him. He wanted me to dress as a happy housewife and tell him what would be for dinner. How are the 2 dogs and cat, imaginary, doing? What were their names? He would tell me we lived in Italy. I forgot where, but he described to me a large house with a pool and all. He pretty much would just fantasy play house with me. I would get really into it and he would always visit me every day. He was just a very lonely man and seemed to crave for some human affection and interaction. I felt bad when I just dropped out of the job without warning. I do think about him from time to time. I hope he managed to live his best life. Great. Now the dogs and cat are dead because nobody is feeding them. I used to work the text lines. This was before smartphones. Close bracket. Which are a massive scam. Worker logs into a website. Picks up an incoming message. The screen had a sidebar telling you who you were. Name. Age. Where etc. and a box for notes on what was going on. With the regulars this ended up being extensive. One client spent over $25k texting a girl who didn't exist. We had a few who wanted to meet. We had to tell them some bull about we couldn't. Another worker didn't do their job right, and because it's really hard to backpedal. I ended up with a client who thought he was going to one day meet a girl and got chewed out by management. The entire thing was just sad when you think about it. Not me. But a friend had a pretty young client, mid-30s, whose wife had terminal cancer and physically could not have sex with her husband anymore. The wife was present for all of their meetings and was in the room when they had sex, and my friend told me that it was clear they both loved each other and had decided together to find a way to meet his sexual needs without him resorting to cheating or secrecy. My first day stripping. A dude took me upstairs for dances, and when I started dancing he abruptly was like, "Stop, I just want to hug you." So I sat next to him and he hugged me for 5 songs straight. It was the most awkward. I just kinda patted him on the back the whole time. I think men especially are just really touch starved. They don't hug or touch their friends in any way. Humans need to be touched. Lack of affection can really mess a person up. Edit. Thanks for gold. Sorry, this post generalizes a lot and leaves out notable exceptions like how some autistic people dislike touch. Attractive. Young guy comes in, obviously a college student. Paid me the bare minimum. $40 for private time, and then tried to talk me into extras way above that pay grade. In particular, he kept talking about how attractive he was and how really I should feel lucky to have a customer like him. I found it really pathetic. Honestly, this guy could have picked a girl up at a bar for the cost of a couple beers. The fact that he was paying $40 to get turned down by a sex worker instead was pretty sad. Lots of sad middle-aged men who just want to be happy or die. Ahem. A friend of mine who was a sex worker had a client who had tons of scars on his abdomen. Turns out he was terminally ill and planned to ride his motorcycle around the country until he couldn't anymore. Reading this thread, it looks like sex workers should be labeled as emotional support humans. And I feel that says a lot about us as a society. When I was working as a cam girl, I had a lot of men with redhead and tattoo fetishes pay for private shows. One night a guy paid. I started talking to him and he told me to keep my clothes on and just listen to him. If it was okay with me. I said sure. What's going on? He went on to tell me that his daughter was a redhead with tattoos and she'd been lost to him to the sex industry when she was 19. And he was trying to find girls who reminded him of her and also save them. It was pretty damn depressing. Expected for laughs but got feels instead. I may be fairly late to this, but this is easily my saddest. I had a client. It was all pretty straightforward. Got down to business. And then he just couldn't really perform. I played it off and said it's okay. It happens. He was probably a bit nervous. Let's chat massage etc and see how we feel in a bit. He then decided to tell me he had this partner that always wanted to travel to Germany in the winter, so he decided to surprise her with a trip. While they were driving, the car slipped on some ice and lost control. Crashed and she was killed almost immediately. It was a couple of years prior to him seeing me. But he said he felt like he murdered his wife and that everyone who loved her probably felt the same but wouldn't admit it. Poor guy was so isolated and alone. And just consumed by guilt. Bit out of my area of expertise. I felt awful. I've got a question for the sex workers. Where the hell do I find them? Just stop a cop and ask them. They definitely will know. Not a sex worker per se, but I do moderate one. We had some guy come in with some clearly evident developmental problems. Which at first only seemed a little off. He eventually started begging her to be his girlfriend. Talking about how they would get married and how wonderful it would be. It got really weird really fast. Not only does that girl have a boyfriend already, which he stated, but that didn't stop him. It's a campsite for his sake, and not some dating app. However, I wound up feeling more bad for the guy than upset with him. Not a sex worker per se, but I do moderate one. I sell my used panties, nudes, and dabble in cam work. I've had a lot of interesting experiences. The saddest experience was a guy who seemed to be obsessed with me. I guess. He spent all of his paycheck on me. I wasn't aware at the time. He told me he made good money, so he didn't mind spending it. I also didn't know he was married and had several children. I ended up becoming suspicious and asked him. Although nearly all of my buyer's clients are married, I prefer not to be lied to. Turns out, dude had a bunch of kids. Poverty wages. Could barely keep a roof above his family's head because he was spending all his money on me. I felt so bad. I was ruined for weeks. I immediately cut off all contact. But he probably just found someone else. I think about his family a lot. It makes me sick. I'm not even that good looking. Honestly. Morning shift at the strip club, 10 AM. Had a few old guys at my stage. One was just openly sobbing. I stopped dancing and asked him what was wrong, and he just bubbled out that his wife had just died. Like 10 minutes ago. He left the hospital and came straight to the strip club to cry. This thread is not only the epitome of why Reddit is simply amazing, but it really shows the heart of humanity and how simple human connection is vital to us all. I became friends with a girl in college that used to be a pretty high-end escort. She didn't seem shy to talk about it. So occasionally I'd ask her about any stories or crazy things that happened. She honestly didn't really have any. Most of the guys were nice, professional, and she never felt unsafe. But she did tell me about this one repeat client that pretty much just used her as a therapist. Like, this guy was super depressed and for some reason only wanted to talk to her. He was crazy successful and pretty much living a dream life outside of being dead inside for some reason. They never had sex or anything. He'd just take her out for dinner, drinks, and vent all his frustrations to her. On one hand, she said she enjoyed their encounters because it was a break from the normal guys that just tried to impress her with fancy dinners, bang, and then call it a night. But she also said that sometimes it made her sad too. Like, she wouldn't be able to stop thinking about the stuff he told her and it would mess her up. This is why the internet is awesome. Where else would some people on here ever have a conversation with a sex worker and not be judgmental? Everyone is an equal here and I love it. There are some good things to anonymity. Sorry for the sap. Carry on with the good stuff. Why do I read these threads? Inspiration for a new Reddit name? Had a man a long time ago pay me $100 000 to have sex with him. He actually had no penis. It was missing. So I didn't know what to do. He asked me to finger his bum. It was sad. But the good news is, he went on to be a successful senator of Texas. Congrats, Ted Cruz. This guy wanted me to make a video, naked, of me bouncing around saying go, his name. I believe in you. You're great. Everything will be okay. This thread is making me appreciate my girlfriend even more than I do now. Don't have a story to tell as such, but when visiting my old man a few years ago in Thailand, he told me I shouldn't be embarrassed because he was there and that if I wanted to be with any of the girls I should go ahead. I told him it wasn't for me as I need an actual connection with a person, and in all honesty I didn't understand how people were able to do it with sex workers generally. He told me that sometimes people just needed the company of a woman, or man obviously. Talk about striking a chord. Totally changed my perception of the whole thing. I'm a stripper and the amount of guys who want to take me home because we have a special connection is really starting to baffle me. Like, how do they not comprehend that I'm working as I flirt with them? Maybe I should start being less friendly because it's starting to get aggravating. I had to tell a customer I was leaving for the night just to get him to leave me alone. Fellas, don't go to a strip club if you fall in love easily. Reading all these just made realize how super lonely I am. Getting up and going to work. Not my story. But a woman I knew was sent to a job as an escort. And the client, a restaurateur, tried to pay her. She tried to report it to the owner of the agency, who didn't believe her and that she just didn't want to work. The woman had an abusive husband and was kinda lost. I'm sure it's far from the worst story that goes on in that business. I'm for legalization of prostitution and health support for all sex workers. But I also think people who think engaging in this work is only liberating and ignore the high rates of sex abuse in the pasts of the women who get into that business, and why that might be, are hurting more than helping these women. I had been having sessions with a young housewife, I'm a dude, for about 6 months. Semicolon. We would often have conversations before our meeting, talking about life and catching up on things. I often tried to provide emotional support, because most of the people I had worked with were in need of it. Towards the end of our run, she brought up how she was enjoying life as a housewife now, something that she wasn't supportive of because she had to quit her career for her husband. She brought up how she could live the lifestyle, support her husband 100% and be a good mother to her children. I always considered this the saddest moment because it was her accepting her fate and not wanting to do what was in her best interest. I did this job on the side because my regular job was in couples therapy, and this moment just shattered my view on things. This is more proof that prostitution should be legal and regulated. I think many things like depression and violence would be quelched if people could just have some human contact and intimacy. Not everyone is loved or lovable, but everyone needs love to some extent. I couldn't imagine a life alone or childless at this point. Not me. But my ex-boyfriend was a sex worker for the first half of our relationship. Aside from his relationship with me, the last client he saw was one of the tipping points to motivate him to stop. He was back home visiting his family and decided to respond to someone's post. When he shows up, it's his grade school music teacher. My ex was quite the piano prodigy. So he said that when he walked in, the teacher's face was just pure sadness and disappointment, as my ex was one of his favorite students. They ended up not doing anything else at all. And the two of them had a lovely conversation catching up on where their lives had taken them. At this point, my ex was a senior in college. After they finished talking, the man had my ex play the piano for him in his home. He said that after that moment, he just couldn't handle the shame anymore. My story is the flip side of this. I had a relationship with a sex worker. She was one of the saddest, most mixed up people I ever met. She really wanted a romantic, committed man to love her. We went on some really memorable dates. On the other hand, she was addicted to the easy money and dope that came with her profession. She hated sex. Treated it like a chore. I told her point blank I wouldn't be her boyfriend. She cried and said she'd pay me to be her boyfriend. I said, "Won't that make me her pimp instead?" She didn't get mad. She just cried. I finally cut her off when her dope use started to get out of hand. She was a hot mess, and here I am writing about her on Reddit. Years later. Wasn't really a sex worker. It kinda fell into my lap. Met a guy online. We had sex. And he gave me money. Unprompted. Then after every meeting sex, he would give me money. I was like, okay. So then he says, "Come have sex with my buddies. We'll give you $100 per person." So I did. With like 7 people in a row. And then they didn't give me any money. Assholes. Then another time I met someone online. We had a first date. And I didn't want to see him again. But he really wanted to have sex with me. So he was like, "I'll give you $300 to have sex with me." So I was like, "Make it 500. He said okay. So we had sex. And the arsehole gave me fake money. Moral of the story. Don't try this at home, kids. Those assholes gonna rip you off. Moral of the story is money up front. For years I used sex workers for emotional support. Especially when I was between marriages. A couple became really good friends. Hanging out. Cooking for them. Going shopping together. Etc. Women my age were difficult to connect with for many reasons. But mostly because I was not well off and borderline homeless for a number of reasons. They were my lifeline, and I'm pretty sure I would have done myself in if it weren't for them. Not all of it was perfect and much of it was sordid. But it was what I needed. Why is Ask Reddit so obsessed with sex workers? SX. I think people have so many questions about them but actually feel awkward to socially ask them in real life. Ask Reddit is just a way to XSX worker here. This story is from over a decade ago when I was 17. I was using Craigslist and a guy had me come to his trailer in a trailer park. He had won $100K in a scratch off. He had a pipe and asked if I wanted a hit. I assumed it was weed and took a hit. But as I exhaled I realized how wrong I was. It was the first time I ever tried crack. He was extremely rough. And broke 2 of my ribs. But gave me $1,500 to cover hospital expenses. The sad part is that I went back to see him 3 times. Whenever I was desperate. I just told this story earlier today because my rehab facility was just approved for 16 beds to help women in sex trafficking that are also addicted to opioids. Not a client, but a friend of mine once told me she could never eat a Big Mac again because that's what her mother would treat her with after she sold her out for sex when she was just a young child. For some crack. I've never cringed so hard by a personal story so hard in my life. I always immediately empathize for the children who don't have a choice in the matter, especially after my friend shared what had happened to her as a child. That is permanent damage when the one person in this world, your mother, which is supposed to keep you safe, and does the complete opposite because she suffers from the disease of addiction.